March 17, 1942. Corregidor Island, Philippines. General Douglas MacArthur stood on a pier waiting for a PT boat. Japanese forces controlled the Philippines. American and Filipino troops were surrounded, starving, dying. MacArthur had commanded the defense for 3 months. Now he was leaving. President Roosevelt had ordered him to Australia. The evacuation was classified as top secret. Only essential personnel would accompany him. The rest of the garrison, 78,000 men, would be left behind to fight or surrender. MacArthur's last words to his staff on Corregidor were recorded: "I shall return." The PT boat departed at sunset. MacArthur reached Australia on March 21st. He held a press conference immediately. He told reporters, "I came through and I shall return." The statement became iconic. MacArthur, the hero. MacArthur, who escaped to lead the fight back to the Philippines. MacArthur, who would liberate the islands. Admiral Ernest King read the press reports in Washington. He was Chief of Naval Operations, commander of the entire U.S. Navy. He had just read MacArthur's cable requesting resources for the return to the Philippines. King's response to his staff was direct. MacArthur is fighting his own war. He wants the Navy to support his personal vendetta. That won't happen. The war within the Pacific Theater had begun. April 1942. Washington divided the Pacific into 2 command zones. Southwest Pacific area, MacArthur commanded. This included Australia, New Guinea, the Philippines, and the Dutch East Indies. Army and Army Air Forces reported to MacArthur. Navy forces assigned to the area reported to MacArthur. Pacific Ocean areas, Admiral Chester Nimitz commanded. This included everything else: the Central Pacific, the South Pacific, the North Pacific. All naval forces, all marine forces, all operations across the vast ocean. The division was political. MacArthur had powerful supporters in Congress and the press. He couldn't be subordinated to a naval officer. His ego wouldn't accept it. The public wouldn't understand it. Nimitz had the ships, the carriers, the amphibious capability. He controlled the logistics that made Pacific operations possible. But he couldn't command MacArthur. The result was 2 separate wars: MacArthur pushing north through New Guinea toward the Philippines, Nimitz driving west across the Central Pacific toward Japan, both campaigns competing for the same limited resources. Admiral King controlled those resources. He decided which operation received carriers, amphibious ships, landing craft, supplies. And King despised MacArthur. The feeling was mutual. MacArthur's strategic goal never changed: return to the Philippines. He argued the liberation of the Philippines was essential, that American credibility in Asia required it, that Filipino troops fighting alongside Americans deserved liberation, that bypassing the Philippines would be a betrayal. The Navy had a different view. The Philippines were strategically irrelevant. The route to Japan went through the Central Pacific, island hopping, capture bases for bombers, strangle Japanese supply lines, invade Japan directly. The Philippines sat off to the side. Occupying them would require massive resources for limited strategic gain. Better to bypass them entirely and cut them off from Japan. Admiral King made this argument directly to the Joint Chiefs of Staff in May 1943. The Central Pacific Drive should receive priority. MacArthur's operations should be limited to defensive positions in New Guinea. All offensive power should concentrate on Nimitz's advance. MacArthur fought back. He submitted strategic assessments arguing that the Central Pacific approach was wasteful, that amphibious assaults on fortified islands cost too many casualties, that the New Guinea approach was cheaper and more effective. He went to the press. MacArthur's supporters in Congress received briefings on the strategic debate. Newspapers ran articles questioning Navy strategy. Radio commentators praised MacArthur's leadership while criticizing unnamed naval officers. King received reports that MacArthur was leaking classified strategic discussions to friendly journalists, that MacArthur was conducting a political campaign to undermine naval strategy. The war within the Pacific Theater became personal. May 1943. MacArthur requested submarine support for operations along the New Guinea coast. The Navy had submarines operating throughout the Pacific. They were sinking Japanese merchant ships, disrupting supply lines, conducting reconnaissance. Admiral King controlled submarine deployment from Washington. MacArthur wanted submarines assigned directly to his command, under his operational control, to support his specific operations. King refused. Submarines were a strategic asset. They operated across the entire Pacific. Assigning them permanently to MacArthur's area would reduce their effectiveness. MacArthur responded with a formal complaint to the Joint Chiefs. He argued that Navy refusal to support Southwest Pacific operations endangered his forces, that submarine support was essential for postal operations, that the Navy was prioritizing its own operations over joint requirements. King's response was blunt. Submarines were naval assets under naval command. MacArthur could request support for specific operations, but submarines would not be permanently assigned to his theater. The dispute escalated. MacArthur sent additional cables. He characterized Navy resistance as bureaucratic obstruction. He suggested Navy officers were more interested in protecting service prerogatives than winning the war. The Navy's response was to deny MacArthur's next request for carrier support. June 1943. MacArthur requested carrier support for an amphibious landing at Leyte, New Guinea. The operation required air superiority over the landing beaches. MacArthur's land-based aircraft couldn't provide adequate coverage. He needed carriers. Admiral King had carriers available, but he was planning operations in the Central Pacific. Carriers assigned to MacArthur couldn't participate in Nimitz's operations. King told the Joint Chiefs that carrier support for MacArthur was impossible. The carriers were committed to Central Pacific operations. MacArthur would have to rely on land-based air. MacArthur responded that without carrier support, the Leyte operation would fail, that casualties would be unacceptable, that the Navy was refusing to support joint operations. The Joint Chiefs ordered King to provide limited carrier support. 2 carriers, temporary assignment. They would return to Nimitz's command immediately after the operation. King complied, but he attached conditions. The carriers would operate under naval command, not MacArthur's. They would provide support for exactly 5 days. Then they would withdraw regardless of operational status. MacArthur accepted. The Leyte operation launched on September 4, 1943. The carriers provided air support. The landing succeeded with minimal casualties, but the carriers withdrew on schedule. MacArthur requested extension. The Navy refused. The carriers returned to Nimitz's command. MacArthur's next cable to Washington stated that Navy withdrawal of support had endangered the operation, that if casualties had resulted, Navy officers would be responsible. King's response was to delay approval for MacArthur's next operation. March 1944. The Joint Chiefs of Staff convened in Washington to decide Pacific strategy. 2 options. MacArthur's plan, continue through New Guinea to the Philippines. Nimitz's plan, bypass the Philippines and strike directly at Formosa or the China coast. MacArthur flew to Washington to present his case personally. He met with President Roosevelt, the Joint Chiefs, and congressional leaders. His argument was political as much as military. The United States had a moral obligation to liberate the Philippines. American credibility in Asia depended on it. Filipino forces fighting alongside Americans deserved liberation. Bypassing the Philippines would destroy American prestige. He also argued military necessity. The Philippines controlled sea lanes between Japan and resource areas in Southeast Asia. Occupying them would cut Japanese supply lines more effectively than any other operation. Admiral King presented the Navy's position. The Philippines were a dead end. They didn't provide bases for invading Japan. They required massive resources to occupy and defend. The direct route to Japan went through the Central Pacific. Formosa offered everything the Philippines did not: airfields within range of Japan, ports for supporting invasion forces, strategic position for strangling Japanese logistics. The debate continued for weeks. MacArthur lobbied Congress. Navy officers briefed War Department officials. The press ran competing articles about strategic options. President Roosevelt decided to settle the argument personally. He called a conference in Hawaii for July 1944. MacArthur and Nimitz would present their cases. Roosevelt would decide. July 26, 1944, Pearl Harbor. MacArthur and Nimitz met with President Roosevelt. MacArthur arrived in full uniform with his signature sunglasses and corncob pipe. He brought charts, maps, and detailed operational plans. He was prepared to perform. Nimitz arrived in standard naval uniform. He brought his operations officer and strategic assessments. He was prepared to brief. Roosevelt opened the meeting by noting the strategic question: Philippines or Formosa? MacArthur spoke first. He made his case for the Philippines with theatrical intensity. He described the moral imperative, the strategic necessity, the operational feasibility. He emphasized American credibility and commitment to allies. He concluded by stating directly, "If we bypass the Philippines, American prestige in Asia will be destroyed. The people will never forgive us. History will judge us harshly." Nimitz presented the Navy's position. Formosa offered superior strategic advantages. It was closer to Japan. It provided better bases. It required fewer resources to capture and hold. The Philippines could be neutralized through naval blockade and air attack. Occupation was unnecessary. Direct approach to Japan was more efficient. Roosevelt asked questions. He probed both plans. He considered political implications alongside military factors. Then he made his decision. The Philippines would be liberated. MacArthur would command the operation. Nimitz would provide naval support. MacArthur had won. Admiral King received the news in Washington. His response to staff officers was recorded. MacArthur sold the president a political operation disguised as military necessity. "We'll provide the ships, he'll get the glory." The Navy would support MacArthur's return to the Philippines, but they would remember who forced the decision. October 20th, 1944. American forces landed at Leyte in the Philippines. MacArthur waded ashore with photographers present. His statement was prepared: "I have returned." The landing was covered extensively. MacArthur dominated the news. The Navy provided the ships, the air cover, the logistics, but the story was MacArthur's triumphant return. Behind the scenes, the operation was straining Navy resources to the limit. Japanese naval forces launched their last major fleet action. The Battle of Leyte Gulf became the largest naval battle in history. The Navy fought 4 separate engagements over 3 days. They sank most of the remaining Japanese fleet. They prevented Japanese forces from reaching the landing beaches. They protected MacArthur's forces from naval attack. American naval casualties exceeded 3,000 killed. 28 ships were sunk or heavily damaged. The victory came at enormous cost. MacArthur's press releases described the liberation of the Philippines as a masterstroke of strategic planning. He praised the courage of ground forces. He mentioned naval support briefly in operational context. Navy officers read the press releases with growing anger. Their ships had fought the largest naval battle in history. Their sailors had died by thousands. MacArthur's statements made it sound like the Navy had provided transportation. Admiral William Halsey commanded the naval forces at Leyte Gulf. His assessment was direct. MacArthur takes credit for everything and blames the Navy for anything that goes wrong. The Navy's opinion of MacArthur hardened into permanent hostility. The battle for the Philippines continued through early 1945. Ground combat was brutal. Japanese forces defended Manila street by street. Casualties on both sides were heavy. MacArthur's communiques described the operations in detail. His headquarters issued daily press releases. The coverage emphasized MacArthur's strategic brilliance and tactical decisions. Naval support was mentioned in technical terms. Ships provided fire support. Aircraft provided air cover. Logistics maintained supply lines. But the narrative was always MacArthur's leadership producing victory. The Navy noticed. Every major operation followed the same pattern. Naval forces provided essential support. MacArthur's press releases minimized that support. Credit flowed to MacArthur personally. In February 1945, MacArthur's forces liberated the Santo Tomas internment camp in Manila. 3,000 American civilians were freed. The emotional impact was enormous. Press coverage was extensive. MacArthur held a ceremony at the camp. He gave a speech about liberation and American resolve. Photographers captured the moment. The images appeared in newspapers worldwide. Navy officers noted that naval gunfire had supported the ground forces fighting into Manila, that carrier aircraft had provided air cover, that naval logistics had supplied the operation. None of this appeared in MacArthur's narrative. Admiral Nimitz sent a private message to Admiral King. The message noted that MacArthur's publicity operation was as sophisticated as his military operations, that Navy contributions were being systematically erased from public accounts, that something should be done. King's response: focus on winning the war. MacArthur's ego is his problem. Don't engage in public disputes. But the resentment continued to build. August 1945. Japan surrendered. The question became, who would command the occupation? MacArthur was the obvious choice. He had commanded Southwest Pacific forces throughout the war. He had liberated the Philippines. He had the public profile. He had the political support. But the Navy had fought the Central Pacific Campaign. They had provided the carriers, the ships, the amphibious capability. They had won the naval battles that made invasion of Japan possible. They had suffered enormous casualties. Admiral King argued that the occupation should be a joint command, that both Army and Navy should have equal authority, that the Navy's contribution to Pacific victory deserved recognition. The Joint Chiefs decided otherwise. MacArthur would be Supreme Commander for the Allied powers in Japan. He would command occupation forces. He would oversee Japanese reconstruction. He would have virtually unlimited authority. The Navy would provide support, transport, logistics, security, but MacArthur would command. King's final assessment before retiring as Chief of Naval Operations was stark. The Army got MacArthur. The Navy got nothing. On September 2, 1945, the surrender ceremony took place on the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay. MacArthur presided. He signed first. Then representatives of Allied nations signed. The ceremony was broadcast worldwide. MacArthur's speech emphasized Allied unity and future peace. It made brief reference to naval and military forces. The narrative was MacArthur accepting Japanese surrender on behalf of Allied powers. Fleet Admiral Chester Nimitz signed on behalf of the United States after MacArthur. He said nothing. He signed and stepped back. The Navy had provided the ship. The Navy had won the Pacific, but MacArthur stood at the center of history. After the war, military historians began documenting the Pacific campaigns. The official histories required cooperation between Army and Navy. The cooperation was minimal. Army historians emphasized MacArthur's Southwest Pacific campaigns. Navy historians emphasized the Central Pacific Drive and naval battles. Disagreements emerged over credit for specific operations. Who had been essential for victory? Whose strategy had been correct? Which service had contributed more? MacArthur's memoirs, published in 1964, described his strategic vision and operational decisions in detail. They minimized Navy contributions. They portrayed MacArthur as the architect of Pacific victory, with naval forces providing necessary but secondary support. Navy veterans read the memoirs with fury. Admiral Halsey, who had commanded Third Fleet through the final year of the war, wrote that MacArthur's account was revisionist mythology designed to inflate his own reputation at the Navy's expense. The dispute went public. Veterans organizations took positions. Press coverage revived wartime controversies, the command structure, the strategic debates, the credit for victory. Academic historians tried to assess the competing narratives objectively. They documented that both campaigns had been essential, that MacArthur's advance through New Guinea had tied down Japanese forces, that Nimitz's Central Pacific Drive had destroyed Japanese naval power, that victory required both. But the personal animosity remained. MacArthur believed he had won the Pacific War despite Navy obstruction. The Navy believed they had won despite having to support MacArthur's political theater. Neither side ever conceded. The war within the Pacific theater shaped American military structure for decades. The 1947 National Security Act created the Department of Defense. It was supposed to unify the services. Instead, it formalized their separation. The Army, Navy, and Air Force would compete for resources, missions, and prestige. The interservice rivalries of the Pacific War became permanent features of American defense policy. Each service developed its own strategic doctrine. Each argued for priority and budgeting. Each competed for influence. MacArthur's relationship with the Navy became a case study in failed joint operations. Military staff colleges taught it as an example of how not to conduct coalition warfare. The lesson was clear. Personal animosity between commanders damages operations. But the lessons weren't learned. Korea saw similar disputes. Vietnam repeated the pattern. Every conflict involving multiple services produced inter-service friction. The Navy's hatred of MacArthur became institutional memory. Officers who had served in the Pacific told stories to junior officers. The stories emphasized MacArthur's ego, his publicity operations, his minimizing of naval contributions. The narratives were passed down through generations. MacArthur died in 1964. Navy officers who had served under him in the Pacific read the obituaries. The press praised his military genius and strategic vision. He was remembered as one of the great commanders of World War II. The Navy remembered differently. They remembered the command disputes, the credit wars, the publicity campaigns that erased their contributions. They remembered fighting two wars simultaneously, one against Japan and one against MacArthur's headquarters. Admiral Halsey's final assessment, written shortly before his death, captured the Navy's perspective. MacArthur was a great general. He was also insufferable to work with. The Navy won the Pacific War. MacArthur took the credit. That's what we remember. The cable King wrote in March 1942 remained accurate throughout the war. MacArthur is fighting his own war. The Navy fought theirs.